So if you like these long bedtime stories, then feel free to give a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel and share these stories with others who you think might find them interesting or helpful to help them to sleep and help their well-being. So I hope you enjoy this.
So as you listen to this story, you can close your eyes and you can begin to comfortably fall asleep. And as you fall asleep, I don't know whether you'll fall asleep quicker with the sound of my words or my voice, or with the spaces between my words, or whether you'll just fall asleep, drifting off, imagining the story I tell. And so as you listen along and fall asleep, you can have a sense of somebody who's just arriving on a holiday. And this holiday was a surprise to them. They don't know what to expect. They were just given a plane ticket and told that a vehicle will meet them at the other end. So they don't know where they're going, and they're excited by this. And so they leave the airport. They see someone holding up a card with their name on it. They go and get into a taxi. And they're very attentive because of the curiosity. They've never been here before. They can see in the distance mountains, and the mountains get closer as they drive towards them. And as they drive further out of the city area, further away from the airport, so the land becomes greener, more lush. And it's warm outside that taxi. And the taxi driver doesn't talk, he's just gazing forward, driving along. And so they look outside the window, they look out the passenger window, they look out the front windscreen, just watching trees going by, voluminous trees passing by. And after what felt like a while, the car turns off of the road and onto an off-road track. And the car has good suspension, the ride is smooth, and the track is dry. And the sound of the wheels going over that dirt track. And as they look out the window, seeing this dirt track off in the distance, seeing how the trees are full of green, full of leaves, almost meeting above the road, with just enough space to be able to gaze through and see the sky, see some white clouds. And after what seemed quite a while longer, the car reached a bridge, and the car stopped at the bridge, and this bridge arched over a wide, calm lake. And the driver said that from this point on, they're on their own. And over the other side of the lake is a grand mansion. And so the person thanks the driver, gets his suitcase, and walks to the bridge and starts walking over the bridge. And he notices as he's walking along the dry dirt track the sound of his footsteps and how they change as he gets near the bridge and walks onto the bridge, and the bridge is wooden, and he notices the sound of the footsteps on the bridge. And as they walk over the bridge, they really take their time. They're in no hurry. They can see the mansion they're heading toward. So they're in no hurry. They want to take in the beauty. And as they walk up and onto the bridge, they look down into the water and can see how clear that water is, almost like gazing through glass. Looking down through the water and seeing fish swimming in the water, darting around. Seeing the way light shimmers through the water and dances on the bottom like lines of light, with barely a wave on the surface. And noticing plants in the water, long green strands of plants that are just swaying very gently under the water. And noticing such subtle movement under the water, looking so calm and peaceful. And taking a deep breath in of the fresh air above the water, having that slight watery smell. Only the slightest breeze that you can notice when you focus really hard on your awareness of your skin, and the slightest sound of rustling leaves from the trees around the lake, and then the sound of the taxi driving off the way it came, and knowing that whatever your holiday entails, you're on your own now to have the adventure. And so the person carries on crossing the lake, dragging their suitcase behind them with the sound of the wheels on the wooden bridge, thinking to themselves how the sound kind of ruins the atmosphere, that everything was so calm and peaceful, the sound of birds in the distance, gazing off up into the sky and noticing some circling birds of prey, unsure right now what they are, but just noticing them circling in updrafts of warm air. Trying to get an idea of the size of the lake. It's quite wide and it's quite a long bridge. And when they reach the middle, they stand there and take a photo in one direction and then turn around and take a photo in the other, getting an idea of the length of this lake, before continuing to cross the width of the lake, noticing there are some small boats, just little sailboats for just one or two people, and a couple of rowboats off in the distance, way off in the distance. And noticing, while looking around, that there's woodland around the mansion, and off behind the woodland are some mountains, and high up in the mountains is cloud and snow. And the person wonders whether they'll go up there at some point during their trip. And they carry on across the bridge. And then follow the path up to that mansion. And then at the mansion, they admire the wooden door, admire the craftsmanship of the woodwork on the door, and knock the door knocker, hearing it resonate and reverberate through the wood and into the mansion. And then they take some time just listening to sounds coming from within that mansion. As someone's obviously pottering around, they can hear some echoing footsteps. Someone's obviously been tasked with getting the door, and their footsteps are echoing as they potter around and put things down and move around, working their way to the door. And then a couple of unlocking sounds happen behind the door, and the door swings open, and they've arrived. And as the door swings open, they see a butler and smell the musty smell of old books, of an old property. And they walk in and they get welcomed. They get told that they're going to get shown to their room where they can put their stuff down, settle in before dinner will be served. So they take some time to follow the butler up a flight of stairs, then up another flight of stairs, and down a long corridor. beautiful paintings of people, of landscapes, of pet dogs and a pet cat. All obviously painted over a span of hundreds of years. And they get shown to this grand room with a four-poster bed that looked hundreds of years old, with the thickest mattress they'd ever seen, layers and layers of bedding, a drawn-back curtain around each of the pillars, tied to the pillar, stained glass windows, with one of them open, looking out over a beautiful garden, allowing some fresh air to flow into the room. A bathroom off this room, with wooden work surfaces, and a bowl for a sink. It looked like it probably hadn't changed much in hundreds of years. The butler left the room, closing the door behind him, leaving the person alone in the room. A part of their mind was saying, just go and sit down on that bed. You've made this long journey. Rest just a moment. But another part of them just wanted to explore a little around the room. There was no TV in the room. They took a while exploring around, looked in the cupboards, looked under the bed, looked in the side drawers, and went over to the open window. And the window had an area that you could just sit down and gaze out into the garden. And they thought to themselves, this would be a lovely place to sit and read and relax, just sitting in this window seat, breathing in that fresh air, only sounds of nature outside, looking out over a beautiful garden, the colours of the flowers, perfectly manicured. Looking out over the woodland behind the garden, and looking off to the side and seeing the lake, and looking off to the other side and seeing the bottom of the mountains. And they went back, sat on the bed, decided to change their clothes. After changing, they decided to just lie back on the bed a moment, feel what it feels like to be lying on that incredibly comfortable bed. And they had to fight to just stay awake. They thought, oh, this is so comfortable. You just want to drift off asleep. They gazed up at the material above their head, the patterns on the material. And after a little while there was a knock on the door and the butler saying that dinner's ready. So they followed the butler through the building down to a dining room. And there was just a handful of other guests staying here. They could hear the clunking and the clanging of cutlery, of crockery, as guests were starting on their food. Waiters were bringing food to the tables, serving guests. And they sat down and enjoyed the meal. And after the meal, and just listening to others' conversations, just being present and in the moment, not really feeling any urge to join in, and no one minding, just enjoying, relaxing, enjoying having this peace, this time away from the hustle and bustle of everyday life. Just enjoying the environment. Before then moving to another room. It was a cosy room. It was a dimly lit room with the most beautiful fire in the corner. And comfortable sofas and chairs dotted around. Books all round the walls. And so just looking around those books, smelling that old book smell, hearing that crackling fire, noticing the dancing light from the fire on the walls. Being aware of how everyone in the room is so relaxed and peaceful, just gently chatting, gently relaxing. And then picking a book off the shelf, sitting in front of that fire, feeling the warmth of the fire on your cheeks while reading that book and feeling a bit drifty and dozy and sleepy. And noticing how the sun is setting outside, the sky is changing colours, and so taking themselves off to bed, ready for the next day, and going to bed, falling asleep, and while falling asleep, wondering what tomorrow will bring, feeling good about tomorrow, feeling good about tomorrow, wondering what they'll have to look forward to tomorrow. And sleeping quickly, and then waking in the morning having breakfast, and deciding to do something with the day. Aware that this holiday is only for one more night, and then they have to get picked up and taken back to their normal everyday life. So they want to get the most out of this. They want to be able to take back some comfort, some relaxation, some learning, inner learning. So they have a look at a map of the area that they found among all the books. And they see that high up in the mountains is a castle. And they read that this castle has some legends and some history to it, and has been abandoned for centuries. And very few people make the trip up to the castle, and that was motivation enough to go and do it. So they decide that if they're going up into the mountains, they're going to need to dress appropriately. So they get some warm clothes. They take some skis in case they'll need them. They talk to others in the castle about the journey they'll be taking, and they find out that it's not actually too bad a journey. The path is easily doable. So they decide to just read a bit more about the castle first, and they hear about a legend. A legend that there once was a wizard that lived up in that castle. And that wizard had a book of knowledge. And by reading that book of knowledge, you would understand wonders of the universe, of life, of reality. And how to get the best out of life. And so they wondered whether that book might still be there, and whether they would recognize it if it was. And the mansion owners allowed them access to a motorbike so they could travel up to that castle, making their journey even easier. And it was only a small motorbike, but they thought this will be fun to make the journey on. So they set off from the mansion, headed round the back of the mansion, and started making the journey into the mountains. And they could feel the ground beneath them vibrating through that motorbike, the high-pitched motor sound as they revved and progressed up through the mountain. Following that path, occasionally, the back wheel would spin and skid. They were heading through the trees, past pine trees that were swaying in the breeze. Following that path higher into the mountains. And as they continued following that path higher into the mountains, they were aware of how the sun was traversing the sky, how the sun was beginning to approach the middle of the day. And they continued their journey. And they couldn't quite see the castle from where they were. But they knew roughly where it was, and they knew that ultimately this path would get there. But they did notice how the temperature began to change as they progressed from the mansion through one set of trees, through the pine trees. And gradually the pine trees gave way to grasses. And the path began to turn to a small bridge that was over a stream that was flowing down from the mountain, down towards the lake. And they took the turning up along the side of the stream and started seeing the first signs of snow. And had to put another layer on because it was getting a bit colder. They could see their breath as they continued up the mountain. And they put on some gloves, kept their hands warm. And as the sun continued passing across the sky, they decided to stop and take a break. They were well past the tree line now, so they wondered what the view would be from up here. So they decided to take a break, get a small chair that they had on their back. They set up that chair and a small fire. They cooked themselves some food while sitting and gazing out over the view from halfway up this mountain. And they looked out. They could see that lake and the way the sun was shining and reflecting and glistening on the surface of the water. They could see almost imperceptibly little boats down on that lake. They could see the bridge they crossed to the mansion. Way, way off in the distance, in a haze, they could see more built-up areas, more city-like areas, and tall buildings of the city. And they could breathe in that cool mountain air that felt refreshing as it passed into the lungs. It didn't have the same stuffy feeling that the warm air had at times down around that mansion. After resting a while and having a drink and a bite to eat, they put their fire out, covered it all over, packed their things away, and carried on their journey, onwards and upwards. They carried on their journey on that motorbike. And there was barely a sign that they were still on a path as they continued that journey. But they knew where they had to go, and they knew that this kind of was a path. It's just that no one ever really took this route or went on this journey. Most people were happy to stay down in that mansion. They were happy to use a swimming pool that's out the back of the mansion. They were happy to enjoy the gardens, to go for walks in the woodland, to go on boats on the lake, to wander into the meadows in the lowland, to see deer and other animals. Most people who came here didn't want to exert the energy it takes to discover something new, to go on a journey like this. They were happy to just keep things simple. But this person knew the rewards would be great. Even if they don't find this book of knowledge, they knew they would enjoy the journey. They'd have a tale to tell when they get home. And as the day progressed into the afternoon, they were now back on a bit of track that allowed them to see that castle. And the mountain had now got far more steep, so they had to park up the motorbike and go on foot from here. And they continued to follow that stream, which was now like a series of small waterfalls, jumping in steps down the mountain. They followed that stream and can smell the fresh water from that stream. They were now well within the snow line. They could feel the crunching snow with each step they took. As they continued climbing higher into this mountain. After what was quite an exhausting climb, they finally got to a point where there was a small bridge that they could see in the distance. That was at the top of a small path. That was a very steep path with hundreds of steps. And the small bridge went over a really steep waterfall that led down into the rest of that stream. And they began their journey up those steps, taking their time so as not to get too exhausted, just relaxing, taking their time and enjoying the journey, enjoying the walk, enjoying the view as they look back over where they came, look back over towards that lake, gazed out over all the woodland. And at the top of the steps, they crossed that bridge and noticed how slippery it was, but they held on, crossed the bridge to the thunderous sound of that waterfall, and then carried on the path the other side of the bridge. And they could now see that the edge of the castle was just around the corner, and there was this small footpath leading from the bridge toward the castle. So they followed that footpath, excited that they were now so close to this castle, and arrived at the castle. And the castle looked a bit ruined. The roof in places appeared to have caved in. Some bits the stonework had caved in, but other areas looked like they were still enclosed and still standing fine. So they walked into that castle through an open door and started exploring, and noticed as they were exploring how the temperature changed as they were indoors, inside the castle walls. Noticed how the sound of their footsteps changed as they were now walking inside the castle. And they walked through some ways and found there was no roof above them, only sky, and that the rooms were full of snow. Then they would walk down a long corridor and find themselves opening a door to a grand room untouched for hundreds of years. Looking like people had just decided one day to leave the castle exactly as it is. There were still paintings on the walls. There was still cutlery on tables, and books in bookcases, and swords and shields and armour, as if someone one day had just decided to walk off and leave the castle. And they wondered whether this book of knowledge would be in a library. They thought to themselves, most castles have a library, and they hoped that the library would be intact. And every step they took echoed through the corridors. And the sound had a certain quality to it, surrounded by so much stone. And they occasionally reached out and touched the stone, touching some stonework, like around corners and pillars, that was so smooth, so perfectly shiny and smooth, where the masonry was incredible. And other areas, like in corridors, where it was left rustic and not polished down, and it had a rough texture. And they thought to themselves about how interesting that contrast was between the rough texture of the stones in corridors and the smooth, polished texture of the stones inside rooms and communal areas. And how the sound of their footsteps changed as they walked on stone and walked on rugs on the ground in certain rooms. And the castle was quite dark. There was no lights lighting the castle. So corridors were very dark, with just narrow windows lining the corridors. And then rooms would have an unusual lighting, often having stained glass windows mixed with clear glass windows that were made up of lots of small pieces of glass making pictures, telling stories in the windows. And the mottled sun would shine in, creating different lighting in different places depending on which bit of window it's shining through, creating interesting lighting effects around the rooms. And they eventually found what looked like a library. And although it was warmer in the castle than outside the castle, it wasn't exceptionally warm because there was no heating. It was just warmer because it was shut off from the elements. It was just warmer because the walls were many meters thick. And they started looking at the different books on the shelves, wondering, how do you spot a book of knowledge? And they thought to themselves, if this book is so special and so legendary, if it's here, it must be obvious. Because anything that special would probably take pride of place in some way or another. And they saw a book on a stand, open. And when they went over to it and looked at it, it looked handwritten, in ornate handwriting. And they could barely understand what it said, but could kind of just about follow it. But it didn't seem particularly interesting, and yet it was here, the only book on a stand, as if it's got pride of place. So they picked up the book off the stand to look at what it was called on the front, or on the spine, see if there's a name somewhere on it. And as they picked it up, so the top of the stand raised up as the weight of the book was released. And as the top of the stand raised up, so one of the shelves of books slid to the side, very noisily and mechanically, revealing a tunnel, revealing a passage, some steps, going under the castle. So the person put that book down on the floor for now. He didn't want to close the tunnel again on himself. And he went and walked down that narrow staircase. going down deeper and deeper. He got a torch out and he followed deeper and deeper down this spiral staircase. This narrow staircase going deep down under the castle. And the deeper he went, the warmer the air felt. And the sound quality changed. Sound became more muffled, more absorbed by the surroundings. And at the bottom of the staircase was a wooden door, and he opened that door. And shone the torch into the room. And the torch couldn't really light up much of this room. The room was bigger than the torch could reach. So he got out a lighter and he lit one of the lights next to the door. And then he went around the room lighting other lights as he saw them with the light of the previous light, until eventually he had the whole room lit and light reflected off of gold, light reflected around the room, revealing ornate masonry, revealing colours of paints that were probably very rare when it was all done, like purples, reds, blues. And in the middle of the room was a large book on a pedestal. And the book was closed, and the front cover of the book had jewels encrusted on it, had gold on it, and they opened the book and saw the writing in the book and realized this is the book of knowledge that they were looking for. And although it was difficult to understand everything that was written, they understood enough to realize this book contained incredible knowledge, that this book shouldn't be removed from where it is, that it should be here for others to discover. They found some pages that were blank, but reflective, with gold leaf and silver. And they read through this book, and they flipped through the book, learning something different from each page they looked at. And they realized that this knowledge is such a generous gift, and it explained why the castle was left deserted, and that this was left for those who were curious, who like novelty and discovery, to come and discover and learn from, and that the wizard's job was to understand the universe, to understand the connection between all things in the universe, and that this book contained that knowledge in various ways, from deep inside people through to the vastest expanses of space. And after learning some important lessons, they decided to close that book, make their way out of the castle, and head back to the mansion for the final night's sleep before going home. But they found when they got out of the castle that the motorbike had frozen solid and wasn't starting. So they got their skis and decided to ski down that mountain. And they enjoyed skiing and weaving between trees, skiing fast on the straight bits, slowing down and weaving and having that skiing sound, that kind of the sound of the skis in the snow. Before arriving back at the mansion, explaining where the motorbike was, and they said it was fine, they'll get it in the morning. And they were back just in time for dinner, and they thought they've got some tales to tell. And they didn't want to reveal that the book was where it was, because it's left for the curious to find, not left for just anyone to go and find, but just those deserving of that knowledge, not for people just to go and take it, but for people who respect it. So they went to bed and enjoyed a wonderful night's sleep in that most comfy of beds. Absorbing and integrating the knowledge they've learned from that book, the generous gifts that that book contained about life, reality, the universe, the connection of all living things. And they dreamt and incorporated and updated their neurology with all this new learning and wonder and wisdom and insight before getting up the next morning, having breakfast and leaving for their journey home.